The 2001 Hyundai Accent. Only 180,000 miles and it needs a clutch. So of course the first thing to do is to get that hood out of the way. And I didn't mention last time, if you care about your health or your windshield, you might want to get an assistant when doing that. Me, I don't care about any of them. My health, my windshield, or assistants. And if you're going to do work like this, get on Fleabay and get yourself a factory service manual. It might help. Couldn't hurt. And the first thing in the engine compartment would be to get all this big plastic crap out of the way. Mostly intake. The battery's already gone. There was a transaxle down there. It's all clear to me now. Now of course you don't ever want to blindly follow a manual. Or don't blindly follow anything. Don't listen to me. But look. Our goal here is to get this transaxle separated from the engine. We're going to be here a while, right? Look at your workspace and what you're going to have to work around. Now the manual is going to mention to unplug things that are directly connected to the transaxle, like this connector here. But look a little further. A lot of times everything in one area comes back to one wiring harness. Maybe if we unplug a few more things, this oxygen sensor and others, you can roll the whole wiring harness out of the way. And of course you must consider the risk of damage to connectors that may not need to be unplugged. But look, I got away with it. And while I'm here, I'll never have to see a wire again. Now this car, like many, has a hydraulically actuated clutch, which works much like a brake system, and in that it has its own little master cylinder here, wherein a pedal is attached to the piston in here, which drives the fluid through this little line, which is usually just like your brake lines, over to the slave cylinder, such as this. And this is a very common setup, with a slave cylinder bolted to the outside of the transmission, driving a lever that goes through the transmission to actuate the clutch inside. There are other configurations, of course, that work on the same principle. That lever then presses against a bearing like this one, which is necessary because it is pressing against an assembly that's attached to the flywheel and so is always spinning. Presses right here against these fingers here. These are all little levers, which when you press against here unclamps the clutch disc inside here. And of course the flywheel would be on the back side. This piece, the pressure plate, is normally clamping the clutch disc, which is attached to the transmission, tightly against the flywheel, coupling it to the engine. And the clutch disc here, the part that wears, has a friction type surface like brakes. It eventually wears down to where it's too thin to clamp effectively anymore. But another way a clutch like this can fail, that some of you may have already spotted, is look at this slave cylinder. It's all the way extended. You can tell the rubber bellows is tight here. The rod even looks a little crooked because it's all the way out. Because what can happen is another point of wear on this assembly is where this bearing contacts these levers. You almost always see at least a little groove worn in this area. Sometimes that goes before the friction surface has worn out. It wears all the way through and the bearing's pressed right through it all the way inside, and the whole thing is useless. And that could be caused by the bearing beginning to fail, getting harder to turn, binding up, and grinding on this more, or just by general excessive use of the clutch. So of course I could be wrong, but I think that's what we're going to find when we get inside this thing. Anyway, this is one of the items that needs to be removed in this process. And whenever you're going to be dealing with these hydraulic lines for this or brakes or whatever, it's a good idea to get a set of these line wrenches, probably a better set than I have, that allow you to get a better grip than the open end of a standard wrench on an item that you can't fit the box end of a wrench on, such as this line. And as soon as you know you're going to have to remove lines like this, it's a good idea to start soaking the threads in your favorite penetrant, a P something or a something B perhaps, and have your drain pan ready. And if you'd like further clarification of how the clutch works, I'm sure someone on the internet, maybe on the YouTube, has a nice animation of the functioning of the clutch, as I don't have room for an easel in my shop and my pointer's worn down so far it won't even point. And be careful with this brake fluid stuff, it takes paint right off. So I decided to remove the fan, because those minor inconveniences demand swift and aggressive action. Just 4 bolts, usually near the corners. Some kind of engineering thing. This is a common setup on automotive hydraulic lines between hard and soft. These little retainer clips on a bracket. So loosen the nut first, because the retainer clip in the bracket prevents the rubber line from rotating, and then you just grab a hold of the retainer clip and wiggle and pull until it comes out. And every clutch slave cylinder that I've seen is held on by a couple of bolts, in this case right here and here. So here's something that can happen when a clutch fails in this manner. When the release bearing pressed all the way through the pressure plate like that, this piston overextended all the way out of the bore and was sitting in this position for a very long time, because we like to keep several old cars around so that when one needs major work we can put it aside and drive another one. But so since this sat for such a long time like that, which is never supposed to come out of the bore, the seal has been probably permanently distorted like this. So we'll need to either get a rebuild kit and replace this seal, or just get a complete new slave cylinder, which usually isn't very expensive. Now, of course, this doesn't all have to be done in precisely this order, but you should consider the manual's suggested order of operations, and then take a look for yourself and see what is in the way of what, and what angles will be most comfortable for you to work at. But me, I'm going to go for this speedometer cable next, which in theory you should just be able to loosen the collar and unscrew it all the way with a wrench or a pair of pliers. But everybody can be difficult sometimes. But we got lucky this time. Came right off. Unscrew and pull. And it looks like that brings us to the shift linkage, which it appears should be a matter of removing this pin, that pin, and the 2 bolts on this bracket. And just like that, the entire shift linkage is detached and maintained in its correct arrangement. I'll just tuck this farther out of the way now, revealing the negative battery cable as the next easy item to remove. But of course, removing the negative battery cable, as I said, was also removing a main transmission attachment bolt. Two birds stoned at once, eh? Or better still, it appears to actually be one of the starter attachment bolts. And guess who's next? And out comes the starter. Now you may at this point be suspecting, as I know I would, that I have been painting a somewhat prettier picture than the reality by omitting the action. But believe me, if there had been any action, I would report and display any significant injuries. However, thus far, everything has disassembled quite properly and tucked neatly out of the way, as this starter dropped out of place as soon as I removed the bolts. Not even any prying. And then by merely separating its wiring harness from this one hole here that it was clipped to, I brought the whole thing up here, tucked it neatly away on the battery shelf without even having to disconnect the positives. So the people who designed this car, let's just say that if I had been wearing a hat, I would now remove it for an extended period of time in their general direction. It's getting to be about time to drain that gear oil or transmission fluid or whatever they've decided to put in your car. In this case, it is a gear oil, a 75W90 GL4. And you might be thinking you can do this job without spilling the gear oil, and you probably can, but you probably won't. So unless you absolutely cannot afford gear oil right now, and I understand, this is a good time to be changing the gear oil. Plus you want this thing to be as light as possible when you remove it. It's getting close to time to start dismounting this transaxle, and that's what holds up this end of the engine. So I've put this in place. I think a rig like this is a really nice way to hold up this end of the engine so you don't have anything in your way under the car. And you see there, I've got this exhaust clamp to prevent it from sliding. But you're responsible for your own safety here, and the safety of your car and your drunk friend. So don't come complaining to me after you kill yourself. So I've got the car supported on jack stands now, because I'm going to need to take the wheels off and separate something to give us the slack to pull the drive axles out of the transaxle. Okay, so I think I'm going to want to detach the strut here from the rest of the wheel assembly in order to get enough slack to pull this drive axle out. So strut attachment bolts are usually quite difficult, so you definitely want to brush these threads with a wire brush, clean them as well as you can, and spray them with the stuff of your choice. It's time to give her the 600 foot-pounds. There we go. Well, that took care of the nut, but that bottom bolt is seized. Let's try this number. Jeebus Christ! Some high-end fuselation in the lower sector there. Now we're mechanicking. Check out that stage 2 weight reduction. The axle's retained by a springy little ring on the end of the shaft, so it should just pry out. And you'll want to turn the steering wheel all the way to the right to get that one out. And be careful of your rubber seal in here. Or you can replace it at this point by prying it out. And it's just a press fit. Just find a circle the same size and gently and squarely tap it in. And on some transaxles the gears can actually fall out of place if you remove both axles at once, so I don't look to see which kind they are. I just take this precaution every time of finding some kind of inanimate rod that fits snugly in here and maybe wiring it in place so it doesn't fall out as you wrestle the transaxle out. And I would caution against using a snug-fitting piece of wood in this case, as the oil and humidity could cause it to swell up and become quite severely wedged. And while I'm on this side of the car, I'll go ahead and remove this large plastic panel that should give lots of space to manipulate the transaxle later. And it feels like there are a couple of bolts up in here, and there's this plastic fastener on the opposite side. And now there is plenty of access. And I'll do the same procedure on the other side of detaching the wheel assembly from the strut in order to pull out the drive axle. And so I won't show that unless I find it to have some entertainment value. And some kind of bench-mounted wire wheel like this is a very valuable tool that you can often make for free. It's great for cleaning up small to medium parts, and it is the thing for cleaning the threads. And if you've got tradesperson hands, it really doesn't hurt to touch it. Sometimes I wash my hands this way. But inevitably you're going to launch some parts across the room, so a backstop might be a good idea. With everything disconnected, it's time to unmount this thing at the 3 places that it has mounts. And I'm just going to remove the entire mount assembly on all of these so I have plenty of room to work. The access to these bolts that hold this end one on are these rubber plugs inside the fender. Okay, it's separation time, and you're usually going to be looking for about 4 large bolts that hold the transaxle to the engine. I see 2 on top here already. There's one down there. And another. And then there will be a few smaller bolts holding a thin cover plate over where the bell housing extends beyond the engine block. Scattered around, like this one here. Should be a couple more on the bottom. And as you remove those, the transaxle will be becoming unsupported, so it's time to get a different means of support in place. I'm just going to use my floor jack, but you may want to use something more stable, depending on how much weight you're prepared to support with your face. In this case, that cover plate I mentioned has a separately removable bottom piece, so you can pull that off first. Well, partial credit. Well, it was a release bearing problem. It did not punch through the pressure plate. It disintegrated before it could do that. So this being the normal configuration of these parts, this being the release bearing, and this part being the end that was visible outside the housing that the slave cylinder acts upon, and this piece being stationary on a ball-shaped pivot point. And so when this bearing ceased to occupy its normal space, it allowed this end of the lever to travel all the way to the pressure plate, allowing this end of the lever to travel all the way until the actuating cylinder came out of its bore. And now I have an answer to my other question that I haven't mentioned yet. When this clutch failed, that was all that failed. The engine continued to run properly, and you could awkwardly move the car around without the use of a clutch. But when I went out a while later, a few weeks or months, I don't know, to start the engine to keep it in good shape, as I was cranking, it suddenly jammed and would not crank anymore. And, well, I have been fairly certain that it was some failed free-floating clutch component that jammed up the works. I can now see what exactly happened is without a bearing between this fork and the pressure plate, this fork jammed into this pressure plate finger, immobilizing it. And I now see why the transaxle removal procedure stated to remove the clutch before dropping the transaxle out of the car. Because spacious as this is, you can see with this end of the transaxle shoved into that opening left by that plastic panel, it would be very difficult to pivot this transaxle down and out under the engine, unless perhaps if you took advantage of the fact that the engine is currently only mounted at one point on the opposite end that pivots, and jacked up this end of the engine to allow the transaxle to slip under it. However, that would certainly stress the exhaust system, and an exhaust system of this age that is still in one piece is not to be disturbed unless you want to replace that too. So I will perform the clutch work in the space that I have. It won't be so bad. So this pressure plate, like many, has 6 bolts in the perimeter, which I will loosen a little at a time in an alternating crisscross sort of a pattern. In this case, really just to prevent any sort of binding. We're not going to save these parts, and I don't think there's any danger of distorting the flywheel, but I always do perimeter bolted objects in that sort of fashion to avoid any possibility of distortion and to make things seat evenly. And it's not always necessary, but it's just an easy rule to follow. And with the bolts removed, it usually takes a little gentle prying, as this also rests on some locator pins on the flywheel. And up falls the clutch disc. So there you see the old worn clutch disc in comparison to the new. See, this thing's worn almost all the way through the grooves. You can probably see the difference in thickness there. But 180,000 miles, a couple of young drivers, and one who is still in clutch college. Pretty good. You can see it's starting to wear right into the rivet there. So this thing was at its end of life anyway, but still clamping well. And there, the new and old pressure plates. And here, that bearing contact wear that I talked about earlier. When you're replacing a clutch, you should take the flywheel off and either have it resurfaced or replace it. However, I'm going to be a cheapskate this time, so, don't do what Donnie Don't does. But my reasoning being, this engine has 180,000 miles on it. I expect it to become a problem before this clutch will again. And I would rather convert this car to electric than rebuild that engine. This would also be the time to replace the rear main seal that seals around the crankshaft behind the flywheel if you have any concerns of seepage, or even just as a preventative measure, as it is not very expensive. But as I said, I'm doing what is absolutely necessary on this one. I'm just going to clean the bulk of the disaster out of the bell housing. Don't breathe that. Apply a little grease to the shaft to aid in assembly. And to the collar that the release bearing slides on. And the ball that the release lever pivots on. The release lever is held on its pivot point with this springy, wiry, clippy thing that got mangled in the disaster and came completely out, but I got it relatively bent back into shape. It ought to work. And there it is, back in position. The new pressure plate will have a film of oil on it to prevent corrosion in storage, so I'll just clean it with a clean towel and some brake cleaner. And I'll do the same to the flywheel. I think most clutch kits these days come with an alignment tool like this. Either way, you'll want to make sure that you get one. That helps you to install the clutch disc, which has to go in place before the pressure plate. As you can see, it still has a little bit of play. So then you slip the pressure plate into place, move the alignment tool, line it up with the pins in the flywheel. Now as you begin to bolt this back down, and again in the gradual and crisscross pattern, I'm going to wiggle the centering tool around to try to feel where the exact center is, and keep it there as you begin to tighten this. The better the job you do of centering this, the easier it will be to get the transaxle back on. And then once the pressure plate is tightened evenly against the flywheel, you would get yourself some sort of an adjustable torque ratchet and tighten those bolts to the factory specification. And the big deal with reinstalling the transaxle is getting the shaft to line up, which is why the attention to centering with the alignment tool is so important. But if you do that well, with a little wiggling, it'll snap right back in place. And if it doesn't go all the way tightly into position, don't try to make it do so by tightening the bolts. Go back and figure out what's wrong. And at this point, it's pretty much installation as reverse of removal, except for bleeding the clutch hydraulics when you get to that point. And so you would assemble everything once your lines are tight. Fill up your reservoir here with brake fluid. And you can see I've got a new slave cylinder here. And then get yourself one of these handy magnetic mount brake bleeding bottles from the auto parts store. And you'll attach its hose to the bleeder valve here. You may have to get assorted bits of different size rubber hoses to make adapters sometimes. And then you stick the magnetic mount bottle somewhere on the car higher than the cylinder, so that as the air bubbles come out, they will want to travel up this hose and away from the system. And the air bubbles will rise very slowly up this tube. So you'll press your pedal to the floor and hold it there for a moment, long enough for the bubbles to get away from the bleeder valve so that they're not drawn back in when you release the pedal. And you'll do that a few times. And since the bubbles are traveling slowly, you can hop out of the car and check really quickly to see when you stop having bubbles. And then you're done. You close the bleeder valve and it should operate properly. So I hope this has been helpful, but if you'll excuse me, I'm ready to get this thing out of my garage. Thanks for watching.